Anyone else feeling really bad right now? Like the type of bad where you're not sure what's just media spectacle and what is full-on fascist decline? Well, today I'm going to try to explain why this is happening.
What I'd like to see Canada become our 51st state.
Within 2 weeks of taking office, Trump has renamed the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America.
The Gulf of America, what a beautiful name.
He blamed the most tragic plane crash in recent American history on diversity.
The FAA is actively recruiting workers who suffer severe intellectual disabilities.
While Dr. Phil is out in the streets of Chicago doing ice raids.
You Dr. Phil? You look like Dr. Phil.
Yeah? How do you know me?
How do you know me?
And Elon Musk and a gang of tweens are apparently just taking over the government, and they know your social security number, so that's cool. Now, we might feel like there's little that we can do right now other than just doom scroll the pain away. But what's happening is connected to a political strategy with its roots in the Soviet Union.
I'm trying to figure out how you can come to the conclusion right now that diversity had something to do with this crash.
Because I have common sense. Okay.
Now, one way that we can understand what's going on and why it's making us feel so bad is the phenomenon of hypernormalization. Now, this concept was coined by anthropologist Olivia Yarwood to explain the twilight of Russian communism. It describes how the Soviet government's self-mythologizing propaganda was so successful that it made it impossible for people to consider alternatives to the system.
The Soviet Union became a society where everyone knew that what their leaders said was not real, because they could see with their own eyes that the economy was falling apart. But everybody had to play along and pretend that it was real. One Soviet writer called it hypernormalization. The fakeness was hypernormal.
One writer describes it as an entropic acceptance and false belief in a clearly broken polity and the myths that undergird it. The term was popularized in the work of British documentarian Adam Curtis.
The picture he gave was of a political class reduced to trying to steer society into a dark and frightening future, constantly peering forward and trying to see the risks coming towards them. Their only aim, to avoid those risks and keep society stable.
For him, hypernormalization means this.
Politicians, financiers, and technological utopians, they constructed a simpler version of the world in order to hang on to power, allowed dark and destructive forces to fester and grow outside. Forces that are now returning to pierce the fragile surface of our carefully constructed fake world.
Curtis elaborates on his use of the term in an interview, saying, "We live in a world where the powerful deceive us. We know they lie. They know we know they lie. They don't care. We say we care, but we do nothing, and nothing ever changes. It's normal. Welcome to the post-truth world." Welcome indeed. While this might feel overly cynical, Curtis contends that Americans and Europeans have long known that our systems aren't working. And when journalists point this out, we all get to say, "Oh no, that's horrible," before we just get on with our day.
No one has any vision of a different or a better kind of future.
So nothing ever changes. And we might feel this recently when one day we're reading horrifying news about the climate, and the next moment we're being told,
"The golden age of America begins right now."
And this gap between what we're seeing in the world and what we're told the world is actually like can create a sense of detachment from reality, or a passive acceptance of the reality we're being sold, or both. I've felt some of this week, because right before we filmed this video, I learned that Elon Musk has recently unleashed a bunch of kids to run around Washington, D.C., disrupting departments that administer potentially life-saving services. So that's cool. And the two responses to all of this seem to be either losing one's mind or just trying to stay distracted. Let me know how you're staying distracted these days. I've been watching the television show Shrinking and watching YouTube videos about maps.
And if I look giddy, it's because I am. I love old original maps.
One of the features of the hyper-normalized political reality of the late Soviet Union, as described by Yarwood, was their policing of language, in which a mastery over words and their meaning facilitated political control. Now, we're currently seeing this at play in American politics, where a series of executive orders have focused on redefining some terms and eradicating others all for the sake of new levels of control. For example, in the official language of the state, DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, it actually means forced, illegal, and immoral discrimination programs. Now, this shift in official language turns workplace seminars on diversity and preferred pronouns in your emails into fireable offenses. Okay, before we get into it, I want to talk about this video's sponsor, Magic Spoons. I've been getting older. I've been trying to cut down on sugar because it leaves me feeling just sort of sluggish and not the best version of myself. And that's why I'm super excited to tell you about Magic Spoon. Now, you might have already heard about their fantastic cereals, but today I want to highlight a couple of their newer goodies, treats and granola. Their treats are crunchy, airy, and make for the ideal snack on the go. They contain 11 to 12 grams of protein, 1 gram of sugar, and 1 to 2 grams of net carbs. And their brand new high protein granola contains 13 grams of protein, 0 added sugar, and you get it in delicious flavors like honey almond, peanut butter, or right here I get the mixed berry, which is my personal favorite. Now, out of all the new products, I'm really loving the treats because I often forget to snack during the day, and it's so easy to toss one of these in my bag, leave it on my desk, and know that I'm getting a high protein treat when I'm in the middle of my workday. If you want to check out all the awesome new stuff from Magic Spoon, use the code Wisecrack or click the link in the description to try Magic Spoon treats or granola today and get $5 off. And you can also find Magic Spoon on Amazon or in your nearest grocery store. And Magic Spoon is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee online. So if you don't like it for any reason, they're just going to refund your money, no questions asked. So click the link in the description to go to magicspoon.com/wisecrack or just scan the QR code on the screen for $5 off. Now, let's get back to the show. Something similar is happening in the new understanding of free speech, a right which apparently ensures the freedoms to use, vicious slurs or racial epithets, but not the ability of college students to peacefully protest.
We're not letting the radical left morons take over this country.
Even biological gender now has a specific state-sanctioned definition, with previously existing gender ideology being identified as a violent threat to women and children. One intersex writer and activist has pointed out that these definitions are not only just straight up scientifically untrue, they make her biological identity seemingly non-existent in the eyes of the state. While the executive order establishes gender at the moment of conception, Professor of Obstetrics and Gynecology Eve Feinberg points out, everybody has some combination of X and Y chromosomes, but it's not until between 9 to 13 weeks of gestation that formation of the internal reproductive organs begins, and this is not a binary male or female pathway. In case the science words got you confused there, what the doctor of stuff that happens down there is saying is that literally the government definition doesn't even make sense. It doesn't make biological sense when it's trying to define what gender is. But the government said it's true, so that makes it true, I think. Something like that. I don't know. I wish I could day drink. I could day drink, but I can't, It's worth noting that the executive order on gender calls for the rescinding of previous government documents on the issue, including things like supporting transgender youth in school. This creates moments of incongruity, as we're all very aware that trans and intersex people exist, but official government definitions of gender are now telling us that, well, they don't. It's not dissimilar to the feeling we get when we're told that the economy is booming while everyone around us is struggling, or that it's good to ramp up oil production when we're witnessing the effects of a collapsing climate. But it's about much more than just controlling language. The very platforms and mediums by which we receive information are also reinforcing this hypernormalization. While in the Soviet Union, the government's propaganda constructed reality, today, privately owned platforms determine how we understand and experience our world. And this works in a couple of different ways. Now, first, reality is mediated by the forms of media that we have access to. So only that which can be tweeted, TikToked, or Instagrammed becomes information worth knowing. And that which we must know is elevated by algorithms that we can't understand, much less control. A recent example is that in the days after Elon Musk did a Roman salute, the trending news bar on his platform was filled with stories about the controversy over Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez doing a Nazi salute. You see what happened there is he made up a thing to distract you from the real thing that he did. And he just got to do it because he owns the platform.
Turn politics into a strange theatre, where nobody knew what was true or what was fake any longer.
Also, he's inside government offices right now getting access to all types of information about us. This is really nuts, guys. I'm not trying to freak you out, but you should be freaked out. Like you should be. That's a normal response to what's happening. These platforms also create a distance between us and reality. As whatever happens out in the world, it's always then mediated via these platforms. So what's real isn't what happened in the world, but what these platforms say happened in the world. For example, X elevating a totally true story about Ocasio-Cortez running around New York doing Nazi salutes. And when everything is content, it's increasingly hard to distinguish between prank videos, influencer posts, clips from a war zone, sponsored content, or images of fires burning down our cities, because everything becomes part of the narrative. And the contents of this virtual reality is often at odds with actual reality.
The version of reality that politics presented was no longer believable. That the stories politicians told their people about the world had stopped making sense. And in the face of that, you could play with reality, constantly shifting and changing.
Now, Yarwood and Curtis argue that these narratives eventually become self-fulfilling prophecies which shape our actual reality, which brings us to an even more bleak aspect of hypernormalization, feeling that there is no alternative to the system. This is what writers like Mark Fisher have referred to as capitalist realism. The idea that capitalism is the only viable political and economic system, and it's impossible to imagine any alternatives. When language and images and media platforms all communicate one specific political worldview, it can be increasingly hard to imagine anything valid existing outside the system. Instead of the explicit propaganda seen in Soviet Russia, we're seeing a similar strategy in the use of politics as content and content as politics. Whether that's Dr. Phil doing ride-alongs on ice raids.
To me, it seems that these politicians are creating what they fear the most, and that is forcing ICE agents into the community where they pick up the target and wind up picking up collaterals that may be around them, as opposed to going to the jail where they just get the target and leave.
Or Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem doing immigration raids in New York.
Early this morning, President Trump's new Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, on the front lines of the administration's crackdown on undocumented immigration and promise of mass deportations.
Which had to be way less exciting than her previous hobby of shooting dogs in the head.
Politicians and dog experts are criticizing South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem after she wrote about killing a puppy in her new book.
Both examples blur the line between reality TV and politics, turning the horrors of mass arrest into sensationalized fuel for clicks and attention. Increasingly, creating and controlling content is precisely how politics is done. And even seemingly non-political events like historic wildfires in Los Angeles are quickly reframed as political events once they enter the content machine.
I think that Gavin is largely incompetent, and I think the mayor is largely incompetent, and probably both of them are just stone cold incompetent.
And at an even deeper level, this taps into the feeling of watching the world burning down the street while we're just expected to keep doing our jobs and consuming as usual. And while things seem like they're maybe collapsing outside, the system just lurches forward without interruption. Ultimately, just like the Soviet form described by Yarwood, modern hypernormalization is a mechanism of political control. Now, writing about scientific and educational materials in the Soviet Union, Yarwood argues that these texts contributed to hypernormalizing the linguistic form and to the growing understanding that as long as one reproduced the precise forms of language, the correctness of the meanings conveyed was guaranteed. And we see this in Trump's executive order to defend women from gender ideology and extremism and restore biological truth to the federal government. This guy has an order to defend women, and he's been accused of sexual assault by multiple women, so that's sick. Now, how does it attempt to restore truth? Well, via the reproduction of a precise form of language aimed at conveying the correct meaning at the government level. And when this controlled form of language is then reduplicated on the very platforms we use to communicate, it helps solidify this hyper-reality.
I was very upfront in my briefing on day one that if we feel that there are lies being pushed by outlets in this room, we are going to hold those lies accountable. And it is a fact that the body of water off the coast of Louisiana is called the Gulf of America.
And I can't help but note right now that two figures very responsible for perpetuating this mode of political hyperreality, Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, own the platforms upon which all of this is happening. Okay, so is there any way out of this hyper-normalized world, or are we just in too deep? Well, the best we can do here is point to what Curtis sees as the root cause of the hyper-normalized culture of the West: individualism.
What she was describing was the rise of a new, powerful individualism that could not fit with the idea of collective political action.
Now, according to Curtis, the emphasis on the individual that began with the radicalism of the 60s not only weakened our ability to analyze what's wrong with society, it limits our ability to construct solutions. Now, Curtis has said that the real problem is that we've grown up in a period of high individualism. And in a period of high individualism, the one thing you don't notice is power. You're supposed to be an empowered individual yourself. What's disappeared out of the language is power. Now, Curtis has elaborated that the failure of leftist politics comes down to this precise hyperfixation on the individual rather than the mechanisms of power. And if we want to find a way to break out of this hypernormal reality, then we need to break free from the spell of individualism, in which we only view single individuals as agents of change. So while we as individuals might feel stuck inside a fake system with no way out, well, maybe we as a collective can do the work of identifying where power comes from so we can maybe, feel a little more normal. And I actually asked our community on a live stream this week what they think we can do to respond to this increasingly weird and bad moment. And folks suggested a lot of stuff. People brought up mutual aid networks, local organizing in politics, and even just continuing to educate ourselves and others on what's going on in the world. It's not a one-stop solution, but I think all those things are really great suggestions. And I would love to hear more from what you all think about this and how you're responding to our current moment. Thank you so much for watching, hanging out, liking, subscribing. It means a ton. Big shout out to our patrons. Your support means so much. There's a link in the description if you want to get involved over there. And in the meantime, take it easy. I'll see you next week.